What you're about to hear might disturb you, and that's good, actually. You should be disturbed by what you're about to hear. You know, in the same way that during the abortion fights of the last several decades, the actual abortion procedure was rarely discussed. Even conservatives wouldn't discuss what happens during an abortion procedure. And I feel like the left, those who supported abortion on demand at every moment of pregnancy, they counted on the good decency of conservatives. You know, they're not going to talk about these things in mixed company, and therefore, oftentimes, the procedure itself was hidden behind closed doors. I'm seeing the same thing happen right now when we hear this euphemism, gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care, the actual procedures themselves for little boys and little girls, or young men and young women, it's not even gender-affirming. It's actually quite the opposite. It reverses the gender you were given at birth. It's not gender affirming, it's gender reversing. These used to be called sex change operations until the left came in and decided to change our language to make things a little bit more palatable. Well, what is so-called gender affirming care? Let's talk to Dr. Jay Richards. He's the director for the Center for Life, Religion, and Family at Heritage Foundation. And first, with the premise, Dr. Richards, if you could, this is kind of an Achilles heel for conservatives because we have taste, we have decorum, and we don't want to get into this really nasty topic. And I think that the left benefits from our good taste.
Absolutely. I mean, the reality is this is uncomfortable. You wouldn't bring this stuff up with your family at Thanksgiving, but we got to talk about it. So what is gender affirming care? It's basically a pathway that starts with social transition. That's where you change names and pronouns. And then if the child is young enough, it moves to puberty blocking drugs, which is sort of freezes their development in place. And then you move on to cross-sex hormones, testosterone for girls, estrogen for boys. And then gender transition surgery. And as you said, I call this sex denying surgery because the reality is that basically it neutralizes, it sterilizes children. And so you wonder, okay, so what exactly happens? So this starts with so-called top surgery, another euphemism, which means a double mastectomy for women. California's Chloe Cole, who is now a detransitioner, talking about this. She got that double mastectomy when she was 15 years old. We know that's happened as young as 13 years old. So that happens very often when a child is still a minor. And then usually by the time they're 17 or 18, you get more dramatic surgery. So of course, I mean, I'm sorry, this is the details.
It is, and I want to get into the details, but I also don't want to go too fast, frankly, because I think that we need to just emphasize some of this stuff. Let's start with the mastectomies, a double mastectomy. Yeah. This would have been a traumatizing procedure for women who were suffering from breast cancer. The only time a mastectomy would be needed, you correct me if I'm wrong, would be for breast cancer, for a woman who has to do that radical procedure to protect the rest of their body from that growing cancer that's in their mammary glands. But now, these mastectomies you're talking about, these are perfectly healthy breasts that are just being cut off and discarded. That would be outrageous 20 years ago.
Absolutely. I mean, this idea that we should remove healthy body parts from children, and these are body parts that serve a purpose, obviously, if the mother ever wants to have children and nurse her children. But it's even more dramatic than that, because, of course, with, say, a mastectomy for cancer, you don't necessarily remove absolutely everything, but because this is supposed to be done for gender transition, very often it involves reconstructive surgery in which the chest is shaped differently. The nipples may either be removed in so-called nullification surgery or repositioned so that the girl's chest will, but for the scars, look more like a male chest once the healing has happened. And then the complications from this are utterly staggering. Chloe Cole, who did this several years ago, still has to wear bandages, still has pain, still has numbness. So as you said, this is not something that any sane person would do to a child unless their lives were literally at stake.
All right, now let's talk about so-called bottom surgery for young girls. What actually is done here?
So bottom surgery, again, remember that this is to try to make the girl look more like a boy. And so it can, in the extreme, it can, of course, involve a hysterectomy, the removal of the uterus and ovaries, but that doesn't change the outside appearance. And so what you have to do is, unfortunately, create a so-called neophallus, so a fake penis. And you say, okay, where does the skin from that come from? Well, it's going to come from one of three places. It can come from the forearm of the skin, in which you remove the skin, muscles, blood vessels and try to form this false penis. It can come from thigh skin, or it can actually come from a section of the colon, which is what very recently can happen in a colon. It can actually be used for the boys to create the so-called neo-vagina. Both of these are bottom surgeries, but in both cases, what you're talking about is really bizarre reconstructive surgery to create either a fake vagina or a fake penis using other body parts and stripping other body parts that, of course, they can never get back.
Yeah, and I've got to think that that skin graft for the young woman, either from the arms or from the thighs, that's a radical scar that never fully heals properly, right? So now you've got basically this bare sort of piece of scar tissue on your arm. But how does this, again, forgive me, but we got to go there. How does this constructed penis function? Do they actually urinate through this constructed penis? And are they able to achieve any sort of sexual performance with it?
No sexual performance at all. So but the best that can be said is if they can reroute the urethra, get it all to work, at least the goal is that the former girl now transitioned to appear like a boy would be able to pee standing up. That's sort of, that's the gold standard. Can you pee standing up? But of course, the child never going to have a functioning erection, never going to be able to, of course, inseminate a female, which is the purpose of this organ. That's what we're talking about. And, you know, again, why would you do this? We might perform skin grafts when it's absolutely necessary, when someone's been profoundly burned or has a profound injury. In this case, it's a weird kind of cosmetic surgery in which you're creating a massive and possibly debilitating scar in one place to create an organ that's not even the real organ. It's actually just a facsimile of it. It's really ghoulish stuff.
And let's go to the boys' surgery now. Is there top surgery for boys, or generally speaking, do boys just take feminine hormones and hope to develop breasts?
That's essentially it. And so if you take, a boy takes huge amounts of estrogen and blocks his testosterone, males can actually develop breast tissue. So that's, you know, that's actually more easy to do, obviously, and less draconian. But then, of course, when you move to, again, the bottom surgery with boys, so in this case, you have to remove the penis and the testicles and the scrotum. And here's the really crazy thing. If they've been going through gender-affirming care, so they were taking puberty-blocking drugs and cross-sex hormones, his sex organs won't have developed. So it won't actually have much of a scrotum or a penis to work with. And so that's why surgeons wanting to do this will often have to look elsewhere for tissue. And so, as I mentioned sort of briefly a minute ago, they will sometimes take a section of the colon to create an artificial vagina. And then, of course, that's essentially an open wound that has to be kept open through a dilation procedure that the child has to undergo sometimes for years to try to keep it from closing up, because we're talking about a wound. So imagine this, taking a section of a colon to create a fake vagina that functions as a wound in order for a boy to appear a little bit more like a girl. That is exactly what we're talking about.
And that's so that they can perform the receiving part of coitus, I would think.
Presumably. And so that's sort of, that's the goal. But as you know, it doesn't take a lot of imagination to realize how difficult this is. And so, of course, people that go through these transition procedures very often are sort of surprised at how they have a hard time with sex life, a hard time at dating. It's the sort of thing that seems obvious, but because they've very often been kind of indoctrinated into this ideology, they imagine it's going to be some magical transition, and then unfortunately they find out it's not true.
What I've got to think with all of these procedures for both boys and girls, men and women, that there's a real possibility for complications, including with the boys' bottom surgery. There's got to be infections on a regular basis.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that, you know, this is barely kept secret. In fact, there was a story just this week about a boy who had bottom surgery. Again, they had used part of his colon to create a neo-vagina, and complications and infection led to his death. This is something that we know this happens. Unfortunately, pediatric gender clinics are by design, they go out of their way not to keep long-term track of these patients, because the reality is that all of them sometimes have multi-year, if not lifelong complications. And then, of course, they're lifelong patients of these cross-sex hormones, which they have to take for the rest of their lives, contradicting the natural cells of their body.
We've got to get this topic out in the open. People have to understand exactly what we're talking about when they use this phrase, gender-affirming care. Late-term abortion was the same thing. As soon as the American people knew what was involved in a late-term abortion, that's exactly when we had the beginning of the end for late-term abortion. Dr. Jay Richards, thank you so much for this important discussion. There's more to come on O'Connor Tonight.